This is Ron Peters.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. As we begin this episode, we have a very hot topic question that we're going to discuss. I turn it to Ron, who had apparently some previous interaction with this topic.
Yeah, I heard it talked about on another podcast, and it was kind of poignant to me, so I thought I'd toss it out to you guys. But how do you guys feel about backer inners? If you go to the store and you're in the parking lot and you see some person backing into his or her parking lot, pro, con, joy, anger, how do you feel about that?
I don't think John feels anything.
The indifference written across your face pretty much tells the whole story.
Really?
He's like,
it's funny you asked that. I mean, first of all, I could care less, really. I'm more usually like in a rush to get to a store, so the first spot I see available, I'm just like diving right in. But last night I went to a concert.
That's right, we saw that.
Yeah, Billy Idol and Joan Jett, which is a great show. And you know how concerts are at the end?
Oh, right.
They're so jam-packed. And so I was a backer inner. Like, I realized if I pull straight into this spot, me getting out.
Yep.
If the person in front of me doesn't clear out before I do, and then I have the pull-through, right, which is fine, then I'm in trouble backing into the traffic. So I was a backer inner last night, but it's not my normal practice.
Atypical.
Yeah, atypical. But do I have thoughts on other people who choose to back in? Not really.
So, because like the question is like if you want to pull into a spot, but you're having to wait while somebody's like backing in, you know, because they start to, and then they got to pull ahead and readjust and back in. That doesn't like you're not like, get out of my way, I got to get going here.
It doesn't happen to me very often.
Okay.
I don't get out much. I'm not a big shopper. Like, I'm not constantly going to the store.
Yeah.
So I seldom run into this.
All right.
It doesn't impact me.
Sam.
so I come down on two different sides.
All right.
I am pro backing into spots. I think there's statistics that you're 80% less likely to get in an accident in a parking lot if you are pulling out instead of backing out.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I appreciate that.
So, like, yeah, from a perspective of safety, pulling out is way better than backing out. Even with your little backup cameras that people are addicted to, don't know how to back up with that one, right?
Yeah.
Like, even with that, it's like there's a higher chance you're going to hit something or someone, right? However, people suck at it, and that causes me some angst because it takes them a little longer than it should. I can appreciate the effort, but get better at it.
Yeah.
And that's where I stand.
Well, and I always tell people, because I am very, very on the pro back end.
You should be.
Side for a variety of reasons. Number one, I'm usually in a greater hurry to leave than I am to arrive. And so backing in is not a problem for me, but when I want to go, I just want to get out. And kind of your point, John, I've thought about that at like concerts or ball games or whatever. Backing out is torture.
Yes.
Pulling out is much better. I like the stats because I was going to bring that up, that the stats actually favor. It's safer to back in. For me, I have a very large vehicle. Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Yeah, big full-size F-150. And it's 4x4, and it's a crew cab. Like, it's an enormous vehicle. The vast majority of the time, I actually park away from the front door so that I can just kind of be away from everything. But backing in with that is actually far easier than backing out.
For sure.
Yeah. Now, the people I heard on this other podcast, overwhelmingly, they were anti-backing in. And they actually said, these are their words, they thought that there was a special place in hell for people who back in. I'm like, and I love these folks. It's a great podcast. But they were really going off on it, except for one guy who was pro backing in because he has a full-size 4x4 F-150. And I'm like, brother, we're on the same page. And so I didn't know if there was going to be strong feelings, but it sounds like either indifference or more or less on the same page as me.
Yeah, I don't understand why they're so anti. I mean, they may be losing some seconds because someone's taking forever. And I agree with that. Like, do better at it. But most people can't do it. Like it's becoming a lost art, which is sad. Like, oh, if there's no pull through, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah, it's like
what are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
It's called driving.
And these people mostly live in Washington, D.C. and New York. Those people are nuts.
That's what I was going to ask. I think in parking lots that are very busy.
Yeah.
And then you're like, there are lines of people backed up waiting for someone who's backing in. That's a different thing than here in Lansing at the Meyer.
Right.
Like, if you're waiting, it's if there's more than 2 people waiting for you to get into your parking spot, it's a busy day, I feel like. But yeah,
it is.
When I think about New York and the kind of lines and the kind of backing up, and if half the people in this line choose to back up, like we're waiting here 5 minutes. And so I wonder, like, is this more congested city area?
I think so.
The impact socially.
The social
and
impact
even
on
the
people,
pace
right,
of life.
exactly.
Like New Yorkers are quick, get things done, get to the store, get out. Like it's a very, when my wife goes to New York, she just notices the rushed pace of life. And Lansing is not exactly a slow, it's kind of, I would say, medium pace.
Yeah, I think we're kind of in the middle.
It's no Tennessee, right?
Correct.
These people are not constantly taking their time here in Lansing. But you go to New York, it's like, oh my goodness, they are in so much more hurry to get everywhere.
And that's another example because the guy who was the pro back-in guy is from Tennessee. He like landed on it. Like you go up to the UP here in Michigan, and it is a slow way of life.
Yeah.
I am more conscious. So now when I'm going around, I'm looking around, especially at trucks. How many of them are either backed in or pulled through? Like I never was conscious of it before, but now it's just raised my curiosity on the whole thing.
If I had a truck, most parking lots I would try to back in because they try to cram as many spots in as possible.
I know, right?
And backing that thing up is not a good time.
Yep, I agree.
I have to back into my driveway every day, every time I park.
Me too.
Because we have 3 cars in one lane that have to fit in one lane, and I drew the short straw, and so I have to back all the way in and parallel park between the last car and the
Me too.
and the garage. Yeah, and so we have for us it's not a lost art; it's a necessity.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and just on another note, growing up at my parents' house, we lived out in the country, and the driveway was below the level of the road. And so in the winter, it was actually easier to get out if you backed in and pulled out, which kind of just got me into the habit of it. And since then, it's just the way I think. You back in, you don't pull in. So.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have the exact same problem, John, where I've got 2 kids and 2 cars, and the driveway is only so big. And not to throw my wife and daughter on the bus, but they refuse to back it in. They will pull in. And like, okay, now I got to deal with this to back out. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
But yeah, threw them right on the bus.
And no, my wife's the same way. She will not back into the driveway.
Yeah, and we have a strategically placed basketball pole.
Yes.
And there was a phantom. Someone scraped the side of the van, pulling in or out at some point.
No one knows how.
Someone in my
Nobody.
family, no one will claim it, and it's because they were trying to. They pulled in head first, and they were trying to back out, and there's the other car there, and so, yeah, you almost have to back in to avoid hitting the pole on the way out. Yeah. So.
Oh, what a rousing discussion this early in the morning.
Even longer than I thought it was going to. So, so I'm glad we have a more pro back-in, group here. I feel better after listening to myself getting ripped on by this other podcast. So
We would never rip on you, Ron.
Oh, that never happens here. Top 10.
All right. Right. Well, today we begin a new series. We're going to do something we've done a couple times in the past, which is just walk through a book verse by verse. And we've done 2 Old Testament and 1 New Testament, so it's time for another New Testament book, and we have chosen 1 Peter.
Dun, dun, dun.
That's it. I'm out.
Yeah.
So this week is a series, unlike last week.
Yes. Beginning of a new series that will go as long as it goes.
We're all looking at each other. Who's going to take over?
I'm not
from
taking
here?
over. It's a New
Oh, no,
Testament.
know,
I
it's
don't
a New
care.
Testament thing.
Just kidding.
It was John's idea, but I'm looking forward to doing this. I love the letter of 1 Peter. It's funny because I think far too many people spend way too much time on Paul. And it doesn't mean I don't like Paul. I think he's great. The Apostle Paul is great. But I think that there's so much that ends up getting overlooked in the New Testament. I was really glad we did James. I'm really excited to do 1 Peter because I think that it speaks to us in our current situation far more than people realize. But in addition to that, there are so many great connections to the Old Testament. And so Peter's drawing from the Old Testament, showing his love, his appreciation for the Old Testament, while at the same time helping us to understand how the gospel is going to speak to our current situation. And so I'm looking forward to going through this book. I think it's going to be a good series for us. Hopefully it goes for a long time, because who knows what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, I do actually really like First Peter. One of my favorite sermons that I've written utilizes First Peter. So yeah, I'm a fan. You said a lot of Old Testament references, especially in chapters 1 and 2. So
yeah, without a doubt. And I think that's part of what's great about it, is that there's just too many Christians who are out there who are like, yeah, the Old Testament is great, but I'm a New Testament Christian. And so the Old Testament gets this sort of short shrift on it.
Yeah, I'm aware.
And I know you are. And my heart goes out to you in that regard. But I think Peter really shows us that they understood the Old Testament as their Bible. The New Testament hadn't been written. And so what are we going to use? We use the Old Testament. And it was very applicable for the life of Jesus and for the early church. And First Peter really, I think, gives us a little bit of insight into that. John, looks like you're taking more notes over there. It's like...
there are a couple of passages I want to identify, so keep going.
Keep kibitzing. Well, I guess we can, while you're taking your notes, we can at least jump in and start reading the text.
Read the first couple of verses and set the background.
Yeah, Sam, you want to give us the intro there?
For sure. As a reminder, this is a letter, so let's begin, as many New Testament letters do, with the person writing to the people. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, it's not Dear Peter. It's
right.
I'm Peter.
Yep. Peter is
I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ, writing to you all. To the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father, and sanctified by the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in abundance. So we got a really long sort of who it's to, and because he describes them by giving some theological input, right? So it starts with Peter and says, I'm this apostle. I don't know if we want to talk about that at all, about Peter.
I'll just toss in for just like a minute or so here. I realize that not everybody cares about this, but for those of you who do, the one or two listeners who care about this background information, as with many of the New Testament writings, authorship is often debated. First Peter is generally recognized as being written by the Apostle Peter, but there are a lot of people who want to argue about it. One of the big reasons is that the Greek of First Peter is actually quite elegant. I love it when I'm teaching Greek and we can get into First Peter. I can begin to show them, syntactically and all the kinds of things that are going on there. And there are people who are like, yeah, would a fisherman from Galilee be able to speak and write this way? To which I reply, you never know. He could have actually been more educated than people realize, or picked it up along the way. At the end of the letter, though, there is some indication that maybe he would have used a scribe. Silas, or Silvanus, as he's called at the end, may have been his scribe. And so Peter may have dictated the letter, but said, you make it sound good. Here's what I wanted to say, but you make it sound pretty.
So it's a modern version, or an ancient version of like AI. We're like, hey, I wrote this paper. Hey, Grammarly, AI, make this better.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a fantastic point, that Silas may have been his ancient AI version, his chatbot there.
Yeah, I think it's worth reading that verse just to see why we think maybe Silas or Silvanus was involved.
Yeah.
So chapter 5, verse 12, through Silvanus, and this is his wind down of the letter, right? Mm-hmm. Whom I consider a faithful brother, I have written this short letter to encourage you. Right. Through Silvanus, I have written this letter. So, I mean, that's pretty much someone saying, I co-wrote this.
Right.
And this person was an agent through which I have written this letter. So, to me, that makes a very strong case.
Yeah, I agree.
That Peter wrote it and he had help. And, if you had this wild elegant Greek and no evidence of any help, that would raise legitimate questions, right? Or if someone was trying through the letter to kind of make themselves out and like justify why this is written from them, then it's just like, well, is this, pseudonymous? Is someone like
right.
trying to sound better than they are?
See what large letters I use to write this with my own hand, for example.
Yeah, there are other books where there are more legitimate questions, but here you have, it raises the question in the first verse, and it seems to answer it in the second to last verse.
Yeah. And again, for those who care, if you were to read 2 Peter in Greek, there's just no question. The Greek of the two letters is vastly different. And so that also raised questions about Peter's authorship of 2 Peter. There's a lot of strong connections with Jude. And so even in the ancient church, there were debates about 2 Peter, but 1 Peter was never debated. It was always a shoo-in for being a part of the New Testament.
All right. So we're on board with Peter writing it.
I'm good with
Ish.
that.
No problems.
Yeah. Okay. The 2 is interesting. The recipients.
Yeah.
To exiles of the dispersion, and then he lists a bunch of places. Talk about exiles and dispersion and all that for those who might not get the references here.
Yeah. Can we begin with the places? Where in general are these places that he's writing to?
Yeah, all of them are located in what we call Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey. A lot of them we know from the Apostle Paul. Galatia, Asia, these places were visited by Paul on all 3 of his missionary journeys. Cappadocia and Pontus are actually further to the north, and we don't have any New Testament references to anybody going there and evangelizing or whatever. The simple answer to that is we don't have a lot of information about other things either. The New Testament is very particular. I don't want to say particular. It doesn't tell us the whole story. It just tells us the bits of the story that are important to the author. And so probably there were Christians who were going to those regions and evangelizing who were not associated with Paul or somebody else. But it does suggest that the letter is written somewhat later for there to be Christian communities pretty much scattered all the way through the regions of what we now call Turkey, even into regions that are not mentioned in the book of Acts as being specifically evangelized.
That lends some credence to the authenticity, right? Like why he's not picking all-star places, right, to gain notoriety. He's picking places that don't play a bigger role elsewhere.
At least not in the first century, without a doubt. Yeah.
Certainly later they do.
Later on, Asia Minor becomes like the hotbed of the development of Christian theology. But at this time, he's not writing to, Rome or Antioch or any, the big ones.
Do we know anything about Peter, from Acts or elsewhere that would connect him to this region?
What's kind of funny about that is not so much Acts, but in Galatians, Paul talks about how Peter and the other pillars said, we're going to preach to the Jews. And then Paul is going to preach to the Gentiles. They're like kind of divide and conquer.
Yep.
Paul, you do the Gentile thing, we'll do the Jew thing. But overwhelmingly, 1 Peter seems to be written to a Gentile audience.
Yeah.
And so that's actually kind of surprising. Now, the part of the answer to that could be that early on, sure, Peter was primarily going to the Jews, but in the book of Acts, he's actually one of the first people to ever preach a significant message to a Gentile audience, Cornelius. Yeah. And so Acts would strongly suggest that Peter was not completely, removed from the Gentiles. And so that episode with Cornelius certainly opens up the idea that Peter could have been in more close contact with other Gentiles. Well, I guess in even Galatians, sorry, I'm riffing here, but in Galatians, Paul does talk about how Peter was eating with the Gentiles until the people from James came along.
Yep.
And then he pulled back and Paul went after him and gave him what for. So yeah, there's a lot of historical context that we can bring to bear on that.
So on the spectrum, you have Paul that's like all Gentile, James, at least in that passage, which is kind of more Jew-centric, or at least the people from James, and Peter somewhere in the middle.
Right.
He's leaning that direction, but there's more that he needs to work out, and Paul got there first.
And to add to that, in the book of Acts, when Paul ever comes to town, the first place he goes is a synagogue. So it's not like he's just like all Gentiles. Right. He starts with the Israelite community, and when things go bad, he's like, fine, I'll go talk to the Gentiles. So we shouldn't see it as like a hard, fast division of labor. I think there was a lot of crossover.
About Gentile friendliness.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
Paul's like maximally Gentile friendly.
Without a doubt.
Peter next in line, and then the James contingent, maybe least Gentile friendly out of the gate.
At least out of the gate. And James is in Jerusalem the whole time. I mean, he doesn't really have a lot of opportunity to interact with the Gentiles.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the idea of being Gentile-focused or not, the letter is written to exiles of the dispersion, which is a very Jewish thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like he's intentionally saying to the Jews, right? It's another way, a workaround of saying to Jews who are not here in the Holy Land, but you're out there. Not necessarily excluding non-Jews, but that's a pretty direct address to those people.
Yeah, the fact that he's using very Jewish language, because that's what happened, back in, Old Testament days, 586 in particular, with the Babylonian exile, not to diminish the Assyrian exile, but with the Babylonian exile, from that point on, so many Israelites are living outside of their ancient boundaries. They're living out into the nations. And so this idea of the dispersion, the vast majority of Israelites at this time actually are a part of the dispersion. And to use that to describe Christians, like right out of the gate, we're using Israelite Jewish language to talk about Christians, even Gentile Christians. And I think that sets us up to say, even though I am a Gentile, Ron is a Gentile, in many ways I have become an Israelite, not in a literal sense, but the fact that I, through Jesus, have been added to the community of believers, I shouldn't look at it as a rejection of the story of Israel, but our inclusion in it. Their story becomes my story.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile exploring on what are the possible exiles that are being talked about here. Because you mentioned the Assyrian one, and I think we have reason to think that in the Assyrian exile, so we're talking 8th century, right, when they kind of scattered the northern kingdom, we have good reason to think that most of those scattered kind of went northeast.
Yeah.
Right? They stayed in Mesopotamia, or the cradle of civilization. They stayed where their culture was. The culture in Assyria and Babylon has much in common with, say, Palestine. We don't have a lot of evidence that from the Assyrian scattering, they went north into what would become more overtly Greek territory. Yeah. The Babylonian exile, however, which, in the 6th century, we have abundant evidence that there is scattering not just toward Babylon, again, east, but also in Egypt and also north. And probably this is where they began to make inroads into Asia Minor, right? And so that's why I think, to think about the Babylonian exile as the possible referent, that's a big one. What other exiles could be referred to?
Oh, I'm really putting us on the spot there. Because when I guess when I think of exiles, it's the big two. It's the Assyrian exile, it's the Babylonian exile. So you're fishing for something, and I'm not sure I'm taking the bait here. Right. I want to know what you're talking about.
Well, I think of when there are persecutions and they're fleeing, right? It's not exile like you're talking about, which is very like, this is another nation doing this to you. This is self-imposed. I got to get out of here because this other nation is coming in, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, there could be like persecution from the Greeks that made people leave the land. But there also could be persecution on the early church. When the heat hit Jerusalem, and a lot of Christians, we're told in Acts, fled. And so they could be, so not formal exiles, like taken away in exile, like with Babylon, but like you could call someone, an exile. Like sometimes I playfully say, in Michigan, I feel like an exile because I'm from New York.
Yeah, you're a New Yorker.
There wasn't, someone didn't come to New York and scatter me, but we know of. I am living kind of in exile from the people that
his homeland
birthed me and raised me, right?
Yeah.
And made me who I am. And so, so exile can be used here metaphorically.
Yeah.
Right? Of I'm living somewhere that I didn't used to live. So that's just another possible meaning of exile. And there's a third meaning that I think the case for this may come from passages we haven't read yet. There are people who could feel like exiles, not because they don't live in the place they were born, but because they were reborn, exactly. Right, through Jesus, and now this world isn't their home, so to speak. They're living for the kingdom of God and not the Roman Empire or any other kind of territorial kingdom. So it could be, people who feel like they are aliens and exiles because their faith has made them that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point you're making there, because that's a theme that's scattered throughout the New Testament. That to become a follower of Jesus, you're embracing a new kingship, a new citizenship, we might say, and this idea of feeling out of home at home, where everything seems so familiar, and now I feel like a stranger. I think that that's an important theme, and I'm glad you brought it up. I guess I was being too literal earlier. I'm like,
right. That's what I was figuring.
Yeah, but this idea of exilic living, I think, is really important, because now the Old Testament becomes the story that's repeating in our own lives. They've gone into exile by following Jesus. You're just the next stage in this exilic living. But there's also hope And this is like set up for what's coming, because the hope is that it's only a temporary exile, that there is going to be a restoration to our true home that I think Peter is really going to emphasize, especially at the beginning of the letter.
Yeah, and so this could be a literal exile, you Jews who have long been scattered, or it could be a metaphorical exile, right? It could be a recent exile, Christians' persecution in the first century or earlier than this letter, or it could be distant, going back to the Babylonians, or it could be both, right? He could be playing on there are people who have been physically spread out, whether from their a Jewish exile or a Christian exile or a persecution scattering, and it could also be, and there are people who would categorize themselves as exiles by virtue of their conversion. And I think it's important when we see this verse because James is going to begin with similar language, right? Tribes of the dispersion or something like that. But with First Peter, that theme of exile is more integral to the rest of the book. And that's what I was looking for before. I wanted to have my finger on these verses. If you go to 1 Peter 1:17, it says, "If you invoke as Father the one who judges impartially according to each person's work, live in fear during the time of your exile." So that exile phrase comes up again. And then again in chapter 2, verse 11, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge." So we have two other references to them as exiles and adding the phrase aliens or strangers, right? And so this seems to be a thematic issue for the book of James. And the fact that the phrase keeps popping up in the first couple of chapters may indicate part of the situation that Peter, is writing to address. As believers, you are exiles, if not for persecution reasons, for conversion reasons, and this book is going to address you in your state of, I don't quite belong here.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's so important for Christians to begin to embrace that, especially Gentiles, because one of the first things they're going to have to do is to reject idolatry. And that's automatically going to make them weirdos in their own, towns and cities and all that. But lifestyle changes are also going to reflect this transformation that they've gone through. And the temptation is going to be to hide it or to minimize it or do whatever you have to do so you don't feel so weird. That's just human nature. I don't want to feel like a stranger among my friends and family. And what Peter's trying to do is to get them to think, no, I have to embrace it. To be a follower of Jesus is to embrace this lifestyle that people around me are gonna find weird. And so it's a great point that he starts out with this exilic language there in verse 2, but repeats it through the letter so that his audience will go, all right, this is my new normal. Being an exile and being a stranger in my own country is the new normal I have embraced. And you either got to embrace it or you're going to turn away. And history tells us that some people did. Some people started out as followers of Jesus and went, it's too hard, and they stopped. But for those who are willing to be committed followers of Jesus, you got to be different. And I think that's so important nowadays. Here living in America, are we willing to be weirdos in our own neighborhoods because the gospel makes us different?
I think that you make a strong case, and I'm for that. That Peter's doing something about bringing this imagery, and to me, it's a great move, right? I wonder how it would have been received by the Jewish Christians, because this was the low point, the low point of their history. Maybe, I don't know. You could then make a case for slavery in Egypt, yeah. But this was like a disaster, complete covenant unfaithfulness, God punishing them, people scattered. And now Peter comes along and says, "Oh, just because you're living in a different place, you're not in exile. I am." And I don't know how they would received that move that Peter made. If they would resented it or be like, "Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's different, but it's the same idea." I don't know.
I think that on the one hand, it's calling people to embrace the regular way of life, because For Jews, they already feel like strangers. Okay, their God, one, lack of any kind of idols. Their lifestyle, it's so radically different. They were mocked they were called atheists. They were called lazy for not working on Saturdays. Their lifestyle already makes them strange. And so I think Jews were used to that. I think for them, the transition was not so much, you got to be a stranger, but where hope is, what you're looking forward to, what's the restoration that makes all these sacrifices worthwhile. And I think that was like the big transition to think in different terms.
Yeah, I think these congregations, they're at least 50% Gentile. Would you say?
Maybe. I don't know if I'd say 50%, but it's significant. Let's say that.
Yeah, I mean, we're told as Paul goes out in mission that he goes to the Jews first, and he doesn't get a lot of traction with them, but he does get some converts, right, to form the church with and have a good
50% might be a fair number.
Good bedrock, but then the real growth happens among the Gentiles, or the rapid growth. So if that's the case, regardless of the ratio, I think this is a unifying move. Like, he doesn't distinguish between, the Christians of Gentile origin and the Christians of Jewish origin. Like, there's no such language in this book.
Right.
He addresses them as a whole, as these exilic people, as this exiles, not Jews in exile, right? Not Gentiles in exile, just to the exiles, to the Christians out there, the exiles. It's in a way, it's kind of leveling the playing field and just bypassing the kind of arguments that Paul has to make, right? In books like Galatians. He just addresses them as a whole, as if they're all in the same boat together. And the reason they're all in the same boat is because of what Jesus has done, not what Babylon has done or the Romans have done.
Yeah.
So
Amen.
Maybe we should jump into that with the next chunk.
Sure.
That's up to me. All right. So,
we done with two? We don't nothing else?
oh wait, no, that's right. I was.
Yeah, there's a lot here.
I was
Sorry,
gonna
Actually,
when you said the next chunk, I was like,
I guess the next verse we haven't even talked about.
right,
Correct.
yeah. I skipped over verse
Good
2.
check.
But you do have something interesting there because he says, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ. And so there you have a kind of, I guess, Trinitarian approach. You have the Father, the Spirit, and the Son all mentioned together. And so, yeah, you can maybe see an early statement that, I guess, John, you probably know the history of this debate better than I do, but probably a passage that early debates around the Trinity glommed onto. It's like, yeah, we've got all three mentioned here. Was this a significant one?
Definitely a quasi-Trinitarian formula. And so those who are trying to make the case that even in this early layer of Christians theologizing, that they have begun to think of God's work in this world in terms of the work of the Father, Spirit, and Son. Yeah. And so obviously this isn't making a Trinitarian statement. They're all eternally existing.
Right, yeah.
There's no kind of hierarchy among them. It's not getting into the weeds there, but that he's already talking about the three in a sentence and their relation to God via Jesus, the Spirit, and the Father is, it certainly is the fodder they would use to make the case that there's an implicit Trinitarian concept in the mind of Peter at this early stage. It is interesting. I mean, the three things, it's the Father who does the destining, it's the Spirit who does the sanctifying, and Jesus is the one to whom we are obedient. There's almost a division of responsibilities here.
Oh, yeah. Very good point.
Did you say fodder for the Father? Just to make sure I heard
Fodder.
that correctly.
It is, yeah. It is interesting. I mean, here you have God the Father.
Yeah.
So you have the Father language in this stage, and so that's why it kind of leans in that in the direction that the Trinitarian formulas would land.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's not the only place. Obviously, in the book of Acts, the Holy Spirit plays a huge role in the work of the church. They're kind of always referring to the Spirit, told us to go here, not go there. And so it's not just Peter, but the fact that they're all together here in like this concise statement, like I said, you can see why the early arguments about the Trinity would just gravitate towards this one section and probably almost use it as like a proof text. It's like, see, it's all right there. Well, it is, but does it say everything you meant it to say? That's sometimes where I think people will get off track, is reading more into it than what is actually there.
So speaking of reading into chosen and destined,
Oh, right. Yeah.
this becomes
Predestined.
pregnant language, for predestinarian kind of theology.
Yep.
It's, the exiles, those who were predestined.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts on that direction of this passage? And this is not the only really passage in the book of Peter that uses predestined or destined language. What do you got there in the Greek?
Yeah, so the word there is, it's literally prognosis. So,
Nice.
Term that people often hear in doctors' offices and hospitals.
Prognosis negative.
Or
a Seinfeld reference,
Yep,
yep, okay.
exactly. And it basically has to do with this idea of foreknowledge, like knowing something in advance. Did God have a plan? Yeah, God had a plan. Like, none of this is surprising to him. It's not like he's saying, oh, wow, something happened that I didn't expect, and I guess I better adapt or whatever. That God had a plan. And I think that one of the arguments of the early church is that his plan always included the Gentiles. It wasn't just for Israel, but these people who were a part of this dispersion, whether you're Jew or Gentile, God's plan was always to redeem the earth and all the people of the earth and all of his creation, dirt, plants, animals, and all that. And so there was a plan from the beginning. Does that mean that everything is foreordained, in a very hardcore predeterministic sense? I don't think it's what it's saying. It's just that God had a plan, and that plan always included both Israel and the Gentiles.
So what you say makes perfect sense to me, and I obviously have leanings towards non-predestination things.
Yeah.
I'm struck by the translation that doesn't seem to reflect the Greek.
Yes.
Like,
Agree.
that's I don't want to say it's terrible. That's just not right.
Yeah.
Right? When you say chosen and destined, that's not what the word means, and that's not what the verbs are. Those verbs aren't there.
Yeah. Well, in my text, I've got my Greek on the one page, and I got two different English translations on there. So verse 2, on the one hand, I think it's more the NRSV, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father. So it's almost like two words. The other side of the page, chosen in the foreknowledge of God the Father.
But chosen's
Much
not
better.
there, though.
Yeah, I mean, that's better. So chosen translates the preposition kata.
Right.
Yeah, according to.
Right.
And that's where translation is. People think that's like, oh, if you just do it literally, it's all going to work, and there's a simple way of doing it. No, translation doesn't work that way. And so that idea of choosing, which even that
I balk it. So, like,
I feel like I'm going to get deep in the weeds here if I talk too
I
much.
feel
about
like
that.
is there not a word earlier in that verse? I mean, I don't have the Greek in front of me where
No.
there is elect ones. I have written in my notes, and but I don't
Yeah,
have the Greek literally to the elect ones, to the scattered ones,
Yeah,
of the dispersion,
eklektos,
according to the
eklektois here in
foreknowledge
the
of God.
Greek.
Yeah. So earlier,
The eclectic ones.
yeah. So chosen language is imported from earlier in,
Right,
in the
yeah.
verse, but not right there.
Yeah, eklektos has to do with choosing. And that's what eclectic means. You just pick and choose whatever you like, whether it matches or not.
but it's an adjective. It's still not to the chosen ones, not the I don't know who,
It's
not like who
carrying
were
a-
chosen. I don't
Right,
know.
it's carrying an idea forward
Sure.
that was introduced earlier.
Yeah.
And
So it's
again, I
not that
understand
the
how
word's not there;
translation works.
it's elsewhere. But they brought it together, chosen and destined. That clearly skews in the predestinarian theology. But literally, like you said, the prognosis.
Negative.
Gnosis is
Knowledge.
and the pra would be
Knowledge beforehand.
the beforehand knowledge. So this is talking about God's foreknowledge.
Yeah.
It's not talking about them being destined.
Right.
And so that it is a weird way to go. And I think, maybe the basis is there are other verses that, this language of destined may be stronger in later on in the letter. There is at least one passage that uses destined kind of language. But the NRSV does this thing where there are a few different words here that dance around God's foreknowledge and the notion of election, and the NRSV flattens the translation to use the same word destined or some variant of it multiple times, which creates a false sense of repetition
Yeah.
surrounding the idea of predestination, so that you're more likely to land and interpret it in the doctrine of predestination.
Yeah. Well, and I think your commitments in many ways are going to determine how you take it. Like if somebody's already committed to the idea of predestination, predetermination, they're going to go, how do you not see that in that word? That's totally what that means. And if you're not committed to it, you're like, I don't understand why you do see it. It's like your commitments are determining how you even define it. And both sides are looking at the others going, you're stupid. How do you not see it the way I see it? Because that's kind of what happens all too often, is that those previous commitments end up coloring our reading of the text. I think that the non-predestination is the stronger one. I think grammatically it's stronger. It's hard to have that argument with somebody who has another commitment.
Yeah, I mean, this passage is clearly not entering into a debate about predestination, right? It's just a verse that uses language that gets incorporated into that. Peter, I wouldn't say Peter's even weighing in on that at this point. But the question is, if this is not about being destined, like an individual's being destined by God, what is the foreknowledge about here? Is the foreknowledge, which is a better translation, foreordained by God, or foreknown by God would probably be the better way to say it. What is it that God is foreknowing? Is he foreknowing who is going to be the elect ones who are scattered, or is he foreknowing something else?
Well, I think Ron talked about before about foreknowing that they would be sort of grafted into this group of exiles, right? And that makes sense to me. Like that, like he knew, like, okay, this thing's going. My people, the Israelites, are going to be exiled, and then eventually there's going to be this church thing, and they're going to be similarly exiled. And so he knew that, like, that was part of his plan. I'm for that, as opposed to this specific person will be, like doesn't seem to be what the text is talking about.
So that would be the difference in interpretation, right? So either the foreknowledge is God's plan to expand his peoplehood to be both Jew and Gentile, scattered among the nations, set apart, that he might be God's light to the nations, right? To be a blessing to all nations in fulfilling the Abrahamic promise, right? That his offspring would be a blessing to all nations. So what's foreknown is this plan that God has for his chosen ones, not the other interpretation, who would be the individuals who would make up his chosen ones.
Yeah, it speaks to a broad plan. The predestinationists, predeterminists want to be very granular in the way they view it, that God just predetermines even the individual and his or her inclusion in the church. I'm like, that's going too far. But he's always had a plan for the Gentiles, and that Israel's place was to be a light to the Gentiles. And he's trying to draw those nations back to him. And so, broadly speaking, they're seeing the fulfillment of everything God started when he said, Abraham, get out of Ur and go to Canaan. It's like, I've got a plan, but that plan was always for all the people of the earth and not just teeny little Israel.
Yeah. I think it's worthwhile just to note this at this point. I mean, not to settle the debate, but just to say, Peter uses language, at least of divine foreknowledge, that could be talking about him foreknowing who would be the elect ones, could be him foreknowing the role that his chosen people at this stage in history would play in relation to the unbelieving world. And this verse doesn't settle it one way or another. It'd be worthwhile for us to keep our radar up for future passages that might say, okay, because he says this later on, maybe that's a basis for going back to this passage and interpret it in one direction or another. Right, and so I think this is a theme we're going to revisit throughout the letter, because election language is very strong in this letter.
Agree, yeah.
And divine knowledge and chosenness and destined language occurs at least once in this letter. To see each of those instances in their context, maybe by the end of the letter we can say, bracketing the whole rest of the Bible, 1 Peter seems to be using this language in this way.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't go further than this.
I was going to say, yeah, we're up against the end of our time there. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up? Or are we good?
I've got nothing.
All right.
Maybe sanctified by the Spirit. What does that mean? And sprinkled with His blood. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, that strikes me as being very Old Testament. This is drawing even the Gentiles into viewing themselves, through the lens of Old Testament language. Sorry, now I want to make sure I'm getting the right word there, where they use for sanctified. Hagiasmos, which, hagios means holy in Greek. But, to be made holy, to be made different, to be set apart, to be different than the people around you. In one sense, it reinforces just everything he said. Israel was a holy nation. They worshiped a holy God. I'm not giving the full definition of holiness here, but one of the things that always stands out to me about holiness is it's just different. The temple was a building. It was a building like any other building, but it was not like every other building. It was holy.
So, Sam, sprinkled by the blood.
It's got lots of different uses in the Old Testament. So you got Leviticus, the Day of Atonement. They're sprinkled to sort of cleanse and purify and even atone on some level for sins. You have it in other places where it's not always blood, but water can cleanse. And so it definitely strikes you as very Old Testament-y. And the goal of that is to usually bring about sort of a reunion of humanity with God on some level. It could be to enter into a covenant. We see that in Exodus, where
I was thinking that,
Moses throws a bunch of blood on him. It's just sprinkled, but because yes, we're part of this covenant now, and so for me, the idea it revolves around relationship, right? It's restoring a broken relationship or entering into a relationship, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I guess I've always leaned toward the latter one. Like the Spirit is the one who kind of sets us apart and is a part of remaking us to be more like the Father in His holiness. And the Son is the one who incorporated us into the new covenant relationship with God, which is the fulfillment of the direction of the Old Testament story. But I guess the sprinkling can be an agent of making us clean. But I just think of, when we're a people group sprinkled with blood, I automatically go to the making of the first covenant.
Yeah, Exodus 24, is that right? Yep.
Yeah. So. Yeah. All right, I have closure now. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad for that.
Well, speaking of closure, thanks for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.